Thank you, Noah, and thank you all for being here. This is a really profound moment for me, and I'm going to try to get through it without crying, because I don't want to do that. I'll wait till later. But before I begin the more formal part of this talk, I want to take a minute to acknowledge some of the very special guests of mine, of ours really, who are in the room. My biggest supporters, my parents, who have made countless sacrifices for me and my partner, are here today, along with my older sister, April, who is a first grade teacher in the Norwalk, Connecticut public school system. In many ways, my sister is the very first teacher I remember having. She assisted me with learning how to read and write, and is the first person I recall looking up to. I would also like to thank my paternal grandmother, Christine Wright. She is not here today, but I am thanking her because she, a very private woman, allowed me to interview her last semester with questions from my students. Questions about her life and growing up as a sharecropper in Jim Crow, Mississippi in the early 1940s. Next, I would like to acknowledge someone who is here, Dr. Ruby Shaw, a fierce proponent of educational equity and a former assistant superintendent of the Norwalk public school system. She established the first public magnet school in Norwalk, Connecticut. Dr. Shaw is a mentor and family friend, and in 1995, she helped me secure a generous scholarship that allowed me to attend a private school, St. Luke's, for middle and high school. The opportunity to attend private school led me to the two final people I would like to acknowledge, Mr. and Mrs. Whitcomb of New Canaan, Connecticut. At St. Luke's, Mr. Whitcomb served as headmaster, now headmaster emeritus, ending his tenure when my class graduated in 2002. When I was a high school senior, he assured me that I would get into Trinity, the only school to which I applied, and well, here I am. Given my academic and professional paths in life, it is actually incredibly special for me to have among us Barbara Whitcomb, who was my 6th grade English teacher. Could you just raise your hands? Everybody can see you. I remember learning how to diagram sentences with her, which is something that probably doesn't happen anymore, and failing miserably at that. But Mrs. Whitcomb was ever so patient, subconsciously teaching me then what it means to be a good educator. The chance to be Trinity's first Ann Plato Fellow alumnus is no doubt a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. So I want to thank Trinity for choosing me. I am glad you all joined me today for this part of my journey. This is by far the proudest moment of my life, because so many opportunities that I have been given, most notably the opportunity to attend Trinity as an undergraduate, are merging and intersecting in this moment, which after today will be just a memory. A very fond memory that, for me, exemplifies the generosity of the human spirit, because from the beginning, so many people, many of whom are in this room today, supported my being in this very fortunate position. And so I would like to thank all of them from the bottom of my heart for welcoming me back home to Trinity this year and helping me realize one of my dreams. And speaking of dreams, I want to say one last thing to the Trinity undergraduates in the room before I get started. 8 years ago, I graduated from Trinity, and around that time, I was very unsure about the direction in which I should head. If I've learned anything since 2006, it is that you cannot steer yourself wrong when you stay close to and committed to your passions in life. So I sincerely hope that all of you will keep this in mind and hold on to your dreams. And now, let's begin. I decided to divide this talk into 5 segments, not to pay homage to the basic 5-paragraph essay structure that professors dread seeing, but rather to acknowledge and follow the conventional form of the literature that I gravitate toward, English Renaissance drama, which is generally represented by a 5-act structure. Consider this the prologue. On some level, what I am doing here today, standing in front of all of you, is performative. I am presenting you with David Sterling Brown, the teacher scholar, and secretly hoping that I'm still recognizable to my parents, my partner, my family, and friends who have joined us here today. For the next 30 or so minutes, you are my audience, and I want to welcome you all to this show, my show, that aims to illustrate the way in which the journey to understanding the past and the present continues. I'm going to do this by dissecting the title of this talk into 4 parts and then offering a conclusion. I want to first articulate what early modern literature is and means in the way that I present it, with parentheses around early. Next, I will address the phrase crossing the color line, which also became the shorthand name among the students for the course that I taught at Trinity last fall. After that, I will briefly reflect on my Trinity undergraduate education in order to talk about the nascent scholarly self from back then, over a decade ago, that anticipated the actualized scholarly self now. After elaborating on those parts of the title, Early Modern Literature, Crossing the Color Line, Then and Now, I will conclude this talk by explaining how those four elements come together in my scholarly work and what their unification means for early modern studies. Now, let us dive into part one on early modern literature. Last week, I had the wonderful opportunity to involve myself in the Hartford community and represent Trinity by volunteering to serve as a formal responder to a reading of a play in progress at the Heartbeat Ensemble, a theater for change, in addition to discussing the lives and works of James Baldwin and Lorraine Hansberry, two prolific African-American authors whose prose and drama, from Giovanni's Room to A Raisin in the Sun, speak to us all. And this past weekend, only a few days after Jimmy and Lorraine, as the Heartbeat Ensemble event was called, I went to St. Louis, Missouri, where I attended the annual Shakespeare Association of America conference and engaged with other early modern scholars about Shakespeare and English Renaissance literature in relation to the liberal arts curriculum, among other things. I mentioned the Heartbeat Ensemble and Shakespeare Association events because together they speak to my hybrid identity, shaped here at Trinity over a decade ago. An identity that ultimately led me back here to Trinity to teach a course that derives from the core of who I am as a literary scholar. In several ways, the title of this talk, Early Modern Literature, Crossing the Color Line Then and Now, reflects my dual passions for English Renaissance and African American literature and culture. I resist suggesting that I have two distinct scholarly identities because both halves are always present within me. Both halves are always connected. So, in the unconventional way that I write the phrase, what does early modern literature mean or suggest? In order to begin to answer that question, it is imperative to note that my academic fieldwork experience at Trinity this year has allowed me to refine and re-envision my scholarly self. When I applied for the Ann Plato Fellowship over a year ago, I passively, if not mistakenly, characterized myself as one who can do English Renaissance and African American literature. Perhaps that passivity stemmed from the need for an academic experience that enabled me to reposition myself as someone who simply does English Renaissance and African American literature. I do it. With this more active language, there is no denying my literary passions, and there is no separation between them for me. Those who know me well will recognize in this scholarly union my penchant for destroying boundaries and rendering them unstable, or, at the very least, you will see my refusal to feel confined. As such, the fusion of early, with parentheses around it, and modern visually depicts the merger that makes me whole, the two kinds of literature that I enjoy studying and teaching the most. In one classroom, I did what some people have a hard time wrapping their brains around. I paired Christopher Marlowe's Edward II with James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room, Hamlet with Adrian Kennedy's Funny House of a Negro, and Harriet Jacobs' Incident in the Life of a Slave Girl and Susan Laurie Parks' Venus with Shakespeare's Tempest. In my classroom last semester, the same room where I was once taught by Miller Riggio and Paul Lauder, I did what Trinity enabled me to do: be intellectually bold and pedagogically innovative by uniting the study of early modern and African American literature to create what I simply refer to and think of as early modern literature, parentheses added. What I realized retrospectively was that the boundaries between the two periods, particularly the racial and historical boundaries, bothered me, especially because I loved the literature born out of two disparate periods and different racial and social locales. I did not want to have to choose between them, not because I am indecisive, although sometimes, like Hamlet, I overanalyze things in a way that might seem so, but because I believed early modern and African American literature could and should be discussed simultaneously. Like any good scholar confronted with an intellectual problem, I got to work. Ultimately, my solution came when I decided it was possible to make people feel W.E.B. Du Bois's metaphorical language spoken in the souls of black folk. I did this by trying to stimulate and simulate the experience that Du Bois poetically describes in a powerful line of blank verse. I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not. In addition to being poetic, this line is political, as Du Bois rhetorically resists his separate but equal condition in Jim Crow America. Du Bois implicitly encourages his social superiors in the early 20th century to sit with him like Shakespeare does and be not afeared, as the character Caliban tells one of his oppressors in The Tempest. By appropriating a poetic style, blank verse, that has its roots in white English culture, Du Bois effectively does several things. Most notably, he crosses the color line with his words. And this brings us to part 2, on crossing the color line. The title of my self-designed Trinity course last semester was Early Modern Literature, Crossing the Color Line. I want to spend some time now talking about how this course, which was embraced and appreciated by my colleagues in St. Louis at the Shakespeare Association conference, where I circulated a paper that focused on my Trinity teaching. While some scholars think a traditional approach to Shakespeare studies is paramount, others recognize that destabilizing Shakespeare does not mean to destroy, vilify, or denigrate. Rather, it means to shift the foundation so that new angles, vantages, and perspectives are created. When scholars implement fresh approaches to early modern studies, we create opportunities to diversify our classrooms and empower students to make the literature a part of larger conversations and fulfill the general goals of the liberal arts institution. Such were my aims in crossing the color line, in addition to considering the surprising way that the issues in question find resonance in the works of Shakespeare and vice versa. More specifically, the course managed critical issues that early modern and African American authors addressed in their texts. Besides 3 Shakespeare plays, Titus Andronicus, The Tempest, and Hamlet, students also studied 2 plays by Christopher Marlowe, The Jew of Malta and Edward II. Exposure to other early modern dramatic writing gave students a point of comparison for understanding the often discussed, unparalleled quality of Shakespeare's work and canon. The course moved beyond Shakespeare to Marlowe and then took an even greater leap across historical periods. African American texts included 2 novels, 1 slave narrative, and 2 plays: Larson's Passing, Baldwin's Giovanni's Room, Jacob's Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, Parks's Venus, and Kennedy's Funny House of a Negro. The interplay between the early modern and African American texts allowed students to think about a wide range of topics and issues related to identity, an overarching theme in the course. Class discussions address genre, homosociality, miscegenation, family, race, psychic fragmentation, the Harlem Renaissance, English Renaissance, colonization, sharecropping, blood, gender, and power, among other things. By scrutinizing early modern and African American literature in one course, we considered why and how Shakespeare manages to move, even across centuries, how the language stands and endures and calls. After all, Shakespeare has crept into our conversations, phrases, quips, and titles. I wanted to offer a broader sense of Shakespeare's impact through allusions to his work in African American literature, and I wanted to explore how Shakespeare's literature foreshadows and anticipates modern social and cultural issues. Therefore, I encourage students to learn key historical facts about Elizabethan and Jacobean life and culture. It was imperative that they understood what was important for early modern people living in a patriarchal society. It was also important that students recognize the cultural value of early modern literature. The foundational text for Crossing the Color Line was not one of Shakespeare's plays. Rather, we began with W.E.B. Du Bois's 1903 treatise, The Souls of Black Folk, specifically honing in on his color line theory, which defines the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men as the problem of the 20th century. Moreover, key concepts from Du Bois' Souls, mainly the color line, veil, mask, and double consciousness, helped structure our conversations, especially at the semester's onset. In Souls, Du Bois positions himself next to Shakespeare in the claim that effectively connects the modern with the early modern, the black with the white. His seemingly simple Shakespeare allusion calls attention to the instability of the postbellum color line. Blank verse allows Du Bois to subtly acknowledge that Shakespeare is at the core of the English language dramatic tradition. And Du Bois' rhetorical technique enables him to show the world that America's racial divisions are entirely based on myths about racial inferiority, such as the intellectual limitations of African Americans, thus implicitly recalling early modern social tensions that existed in xenophobic England. Following Du Bois' example, Baldwin and Parks add textual depth to their modern works by alluding to Shakespeare's canon with references to Macbeth and Hamlet. Du Bois' colorline assertion, which expands on earlier work by Frederick Douglass in 1881, formed a bridge between the historically and racially distant early modern and African American literature in crossing the color line. As such, the course was split along a historical binary, early modern and modern literature, and it was also split along a racial binary, black and white authors. The color line theory and Du Bois' souls underscored the kinds of binaries that have defined social divisions related to gender, sexuality, race, class, and religion for some time. As previously noted, identity was one of the key themes in this course, yet there was historical resonance between periods which allowed for the integration of ideas. Students learned that Du Bois' identity, much like the identities of Shakespeare, Marlowe, and our other African American authors, shaped what and how he wrote, bearing resemblance to what Stephen Greenblatt reveals in Renaissance Self-Fashioning, that early modern literature was greatly influenced by concerns revolving around the nature of identity, the desire to have a self and define the self. The key issues at stake in the Souls of Black Folk were used to help frame the course and its first unit, the color line and the shape of identity. In conjunction with the Souls of Black Folk, two early modern tragedies, Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus and Christopher Marlowe's Jew of Malta, depicted some of the motivations for and consequences of emphasizing religious and racial lines of difference, in addition to other tangential issues that surface. The color line is not explicitly applicable or problematic in Marlowe's play, because color is not a concern there. Christians, Turks, Jews, and other religious ethnic mixes were not explicitly separated by a color line during the period. However, Du Bois' color line theory does resonate with and relate to the racial ethnic tensions depicted in Titus between the Romans and the barbarous Goths and Moors. By reading Malta and Titus together, integral parallels between Aaron the Moor and Barabbas the Jew emerge, for example, because of the connections between anti-Semitism, racism, and what can be interpreted from a modern perspective as religio-racial superiority. The oppressor-oppressed and inferior-superior tensions exhibited in these early modern plays parallel the kinds of racial, political, and social tensions expressed in Du Bois's poetic statement, "I sit with Shakespeare, and he winces not." The second unit for my course, Sexuality, Race, and the Paradox of Passing, contained none of Shakespeare's plays, focusing instead on Passing, Giovanni's Room, and Edward II, the latter belonging to another dramatic category, the history play, a genre in which Shakespeare's influence has been formative. Despite the brief departure from Shakespeare and the fact that my class was not directly engaging with him and his work for 3 weeks, he was still very much present and alive in the classroom, primarily because of the links between the modern and early modern. During the second unit, we, like Du Bois, sat with an absent Shakespeare. The allusions to Shakespeare in the works of African American literature were easily identifiable associations. The more challenging task in a course such as Crossing the Color Line is to see beyond the obvious touch points. By doing that, intriguing discussions ensued that were not limited to the following: the misogynetic relationship between Aaron the Black Moor and Tamara and Titus, as well as the interracial relationship between characters in Passing, the potential use and effect of someone passing for another race or ethnicity in Titus, Passing, and the Jew of Malta, and the difference between homosociality as depicted in Edward II and homosociality as depicted in Giovanni's Room, death as a kind of passing on to the afterlife, definitions of masculinity and femininity, and modern and early modern notions of race and blackness. Shakespeare's plays and early modern drama outside of women's closet drama were meant to be performed, not read. Therefore, students need an intellectual as well as a physical idea about Shakespeare's language and dramatic dialogue in general. During our second unit, my class, along with students from Tunxis Community College and Milla Riggio's Shakespeare course, went to a production of Macbeth at the Hartford Stage. The off-campus excursion brought students together outside of the formal classroom setting, and it gave them an opportunity to experience how the true discipline of drama study is to find out how drama works, how it performs under the conditions for what it was written for, how it communicates and affects an audience. For the trained early modernist, hearing Shakespeare's language seems natural to the ear. But for most undergrads accustomed to managing drama on the page, the Macbeth performance was yet another challenge, especially because students could not look at the language. Students had to tune in more carefully. They had to listen to the actors, watch the action, and most importantly, determine how Macbeth related to our course and connected with the ideas expressed in our African American texts. I should note that Macbeth was not a play that was actually on our syllabus. We didn't read it as a class. Nevertheless, the city of Hartford had something constructive to offer my students, something that we had to take advantage of at the Hartford stage. But how does Macbeth, one of Shakespeare's racially white villains, fit in with a course such as Crossing the Color Line? Following the Macbeth performance, Malcolm's line, "Black Macbeth will seem as pure as snow," emerged as an inroad and possible link between the modern and early modern. Students knew to interpret Black Macbeth metaphorically, especially since they were informed that there were no black actors on the early modern stage. But what do we make of the phrasing that reinforces the color of Macbeth's character? The way that Shakespeare himself casts Macbeth as black? Can Malcolm's comment connect Macbeth to a racially black character such as Aaron the Moor? If so, how? Since early modern players were white, how was Aaron's, Othello's, and the Prince of Morocco's physical blackness represented on the stage? And what did it mean to be spiritually or internally black in the early modern period? And is Macbeth's rise and fall a dramatic trajectory similar to Aaron's, Barabbas's, and even some characters in our African American literature a consequence of his blackness? When considering these kinds of critical questions, students referred back to our earlier secondary reading, Margot DeRoe's The Blackness Within, and considered how early modern geohumoral theory might justify Malcolm's reference to Macbeth as black, a complex term that is both a negative modifier and signifier even in our modern world. I should add that there's a Western history of black actors being cast in a couple roles where the characters themselves are traditionally white. Black actors sometimes played Macbeth and Richard III. It is also interesting to note that the classic Shakespearean texts that include black actors, and characters, namely Aaron and Othello, rely on stereotypes, or what I refer to as accumulated perceptions, that represent black men as aggressive, transgressive, and violent. Thus, Macbeth embodies some of the qualities that later became stereotypes or accumulated perceptions for modern black men. Crossing the Color Line concluded with a third unit, Constructions, Destructions of the Early Modern Family, that engaged students in discussions about blood and blood bonds, family, the female body, and parental power, among other textual concerns related to identity. The primary texts in this unit were Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, Venus, The Tempest, Funny House of a Negro, and Hamlet. Thematic intersections unified these works, especially along the lines of colonization and slavery, with the exception of Hamlet. Though there is a surprising awareness of the consequences of expansive territorial power in Hamlet, this exceptional play reveals the occasional limits of the direct links that exist between texts, even as it simultaneously reinforces that the successfully established connections are real and not contrived. In this regard, Crossing the Color Line, my course, became a demonstration of what I do as a scholar. For me, this was about more than just mixing black and white authors and the modern and early modern. The act of crossing itself reflects the kind of thought process that defines the essence of my scholarly self. That kind of thinking was then imposed upon my students, who actively thought between texts and took intellectual risks in order to call attention to important points of contact and make original connections. Because my own journey continues, Crossing the Color Line, my course, is now a part of my extended past at Trinity, and so now I want to turn to part 3, on then. In more ways than I can name in the time that I have left for this talk, various academic and non-academic experiences back then, in my undergraduate days, shaped my scholarly identity that I eventually assumed. I want to recall 2 episodes in particular because of the way that they relate to a very important issue that we are grappling with in the field of early modern studies, the homogeneity of most modern Shakespeare's classrooms, which is in part linked to the lack of diversity within the early modern field itself. In line with who I am and what I now do as an academic, I want to reflect on two experiences related to African American and early modern literature courses I took as a Trinity undergraduate. During my second semester as a freshman, I enrolled in 20th century African American literature, a course that explored antebellum and postbellum literature and culture. In this course, I, as an African American student, read texts that I had never studied before and encountered authors that I had never heard of before. The syllabus was rich, and the class itself was diverse, with a mix of students from all kinds of racial and ethnic backgrounds. What made this class very diverse, and what was most striking for me about the course, was that my professor was not African American. Rather, she was in fact a white woman. For that, I judged her, misjudged her, and I later discovered that so too did some of my peers, because the white professor of African American literature seemed like some type of strange contrast or contradiction to us, one that was reconciled by understanding that somatic difference and ethnicity have nothing to do with one's scholarly credibility and authority on the WPA narratives, June Jordan and Gwendolyn Brooks, for instance. I brought my own cultural and academic biases into the 20th century African American literature classroom in the spring of 2003, and I left them there in room 106 in the English department, the place where I would eventually teach my own group of Trinity undergraduates. By freeing myself from that kind of biased thinking, I stepped outside of what was essentially my literary comfort zone and began to study literature that I could not selfishly and naively claim as my own from a racial perspective. When I felt ready for him, I took on Shakespeare in not one but two courses, the Standard Shakespeare course and Shakespeare on Film, both of which had a profound impact on my interest in early modern literature and culture, and eventually led me to enroll in Writing Women of the Renaissance, where I was introduced to more authors who were unfamiliar. This time, early modern authors, such as John Webster, who penned one of my favorite non-Shakespearean tragedies, The Duchess of Malfi. In comparison to 20th century African American literature, the strictly early modern courses were much less diverse. The same can be said about more recent experiences that I've had teaching early modern literature at New York University, in addition to the experiences of my early modern colleagues at the national level. There was a time when I subconsciously thought that Du Bois was mine and that Shakespeare was not mine, could not be mine. I could not have been more wrong. As an undergraduate, I realized that literature belongs to me. Whether it is Shakespeare, Milton, Donne, Maya Angelou, or Charles Chesnutt, it all belongs to me. I claim all of those authors and their texts as mine, in the same way that Du Bois claimed Shakespeare in the souls of black folk. Although it might be an easy, if misguided, assumption for someone to make, I am no better equipped to discuss Toni Morrison's Beloved than I am to discuss Thomas Kyd's 16th century play, The Spanish Tragedy. My experience with the white professor who taught African American literature, an experience that was repeated when I took courses with Trinity's Paul Lauder, taught me that we cannot allow race and cultural difference to be a barrier in the pursuit of knowledge, in the pursuit of whatever our passions may be. Furthermore, critical exposure to race studies within the Shakespeare classroom at Trinity, most memorably through Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus, allowed Renaissance literature to resonate with and speak to me in an entirely new way. It allowed me to finally understand that there was a lot more in Shakespeare and early modern studies beyond race that was relevant to me. I should mention that Shakespeare and race is a heavily debated topic in early modern studies, with some scholars seeing it as irrelevant. Like many students who enter early modern classrooms all across the country, I never encountered an instructor of color who taught and got excited about early modern literature until I became that person. And even when that transformation occurred and I joined the club, I learned that within early modern studies, there are only a handful of scholars of color. And this leads us into part 4, on the now. As I noted at the beginning of this talk, I just returned from the Shakespeare Association of America conference, and I now want to revisit that topic. The Shakespeare Association has upwards of 1,500 members, and the organization continues to grow each year, a good sign that Shakespeare and early modern studies remain relevant in higher education for now. However, only about 3% of those Shakespeare Association members are people of color, roughly about 45 people out of that 1,500. In the conclusion to a book called Passing Strange, Shakespeare, Race, and Contemporary America, Professor Ayanna Thompson, an African-American early modern scholar who teaches at George Washington University, uses some suggestive evidence to highlight why the low percentage of early modernists of color is problematic. And you'll see this rather lengthy quotation in your program under Part 4. Thompson says, quote, "If the early modern field were to support the inclusion of race studies more systematically and consistently, then our ranks may diversify more rapidly and thoroughly. I find it incredibly depressing that I can name most of the Shakespeareans of color, despite the fact that our professional organizations are relatively large. On the most simplistic level, this means that we need to encourage our undergraduates and graduates who are interested in both Shakespeare studies and race studies to pursue a career in academia," end quote. I believe that diversifying our ranks, or at the very least differentiating how we teach Shakespeare, is essential for increasing the appeal of early modern studies for all kinds of students who might not otherwise see themselves as fully interested in, comfortable with, or capable of engaging with early modern literature. I used to be one of those students not long ago. Thus, my Trinity course, Crossing the Color Line, was born on some level out of this awareness and concern. So why does it matter who is doing the thinking, teaching, pontificating, and publishing in higher education, especially in a field such as early modern studies? I will use the following anecdote to help answer that question. In the spring of 2013, Professor Ian Smith, who recently gave an academic talk in this very room, published a groundbreaking article entitled Othello's Black Handkerchief in Shakespeare Quarterly, the leading academic journal in Shakespeare studies. In his article, Smith uses textual clues from Othello to challenge our reading of the all-important handkerchief motif, the strawberry-spotted trifle that Othello has given his wife, the loss of which is instrumental to the drama's tragic outcomes. This handkerchief is always assumed to be white, but Professor Ian Smith explains that based on Othello's description of the Egyptian marriage token as, quote, dyed in mummy, a black bituminous substance identified in medieval and early modern medical discourse, the handkerchief has black cloth and therefore can be identified with Othello's body rather than Desdemona's. Smith concludes his piece by asserting that past interpretations of the handkerchief as white have significant implications for the impact of race on our reading practices and its role for so long in conditioning critics to see a white handkerchief in the play. For many years, readers and critics have been blind to the facts that dramatically change how we interpret key aspects of one of Shakespeare's most popular plays. Smith implies that who we are, and conversely, who we are not, has an impact on how we see and interpret the world around us, and more specifically, the literature in that world. As an African-American male, Smith brings a unique perspective to early modern studies, similar to the way that my 20th century African-American literature professor brought her unique perspective into the African-American literature classroom. Beyond my course, Crossing the Color Line, my dissertation and specific scholarly research interests in the early modern field stem from a distinct perspective that is preoccupied, if not obsessed, with difference, and also concerned with modes of power, in addition to the effects of and motivations for marginalization. And this leads me to my conclusion, Part 5, on my scholarly work. To quote Professor Kim F. Hall of Barnard College, difference always escapes the desire for control. I understand and see difference in the early modern period. My dissertation, entitled Placing Parents on the Early Modern Stage, investigates how individuals who are different in terms of class, gender, religion, and race resist being completely controlled. I deeply value merging ideas and concepts, as Milla mentioned, an approach that essentially defines the foundational aspects of my dissertation. My project uses English Renaissance drama and non-fictional accounts in order to expand the way that we think about effective, operable forms of power in the early modern period. More specifically, I argue that parental authority is its own form of social power, one that differs from monarchical and patriarchal authority and sometimes even challenges those modes of power. I'm particularly interested in parental authority because of the way it allows socially inferior and oppressed figures to be brought to the forefront, especially women as mothers and religio-racial minorities such as Jews and Moors. Parental authority enables us to see that women were not always subordinate to men in the period. For example, motherhood had potential to empower a woman within the household and outside of it. My dissertation focuses on the family and more specifically examines parentage. Much has been said by scholars about family dynamics in the early modern period. John Dodd, Robert Cleaver, Lawrence Stone, and David Cressy have made fundamental contributions that offer insight into 16th, 17th century families. But little has been said about parents and parental authority, which is the focus of my scholarly intervention. My dissertation consists of an introduction and 4 chapters and uses early modern drama as the foundation for the arguments made. After the introduction, my first chapter, Forbidding Loves, Youths and Parental Courtship Intermediaries, begins with a brief look at Romeo and Juliet and then examines biological parent-child relationships in Thomas Middleton and Thomas Decker's The Roaring Girl and Thomas Middleton's A Chaste Maid in Cheapside. These 2 early modern city comedies allow us to observe parent-child love tensions and gain insight into the parental courtship intermediary as courtship impediment. In these 2 plays, genre conventions enable the premarital couples, who might otherwise be star-crossed lovers like Romeo and Juliet, to ultimately come together in matrimony at each play's conclusion, regardless of the parental opposition they face. I conclude this chapter by suggesting that if there is a dramatic space or place that tolerates defiance to parental power or higher authority, especially as it relates to marriage and love choices, we can locate that space and place outside of comedy and outside of tragedy. Chapter 2, Playing the Part, Parents, Parenting, and Alternative Family Structures, exposes the configuration of the early modern family as complex and not always defined by biological bonds. When a father or widower with children remarried, a rare occurrence in the early modern period, the new wife and mother substitute might have brought children of her own with her, for example. The union of 2 separate biological families created the new familial roles of stepmother, stepfather, stepson, and stepdaughter. In this chapter, I scrutinize Shakespeare's Cymbeline and Philip Massinger's A New Way to Pay Old Debts, 2 early modern plays that contain dramatic parental families whose boundaries are defined by non-biological bonds. The felt absence of blood ties reinforces the notion that blood is sufficient for creating the family, but it is not necessary for creating or sustaining the family. In Cymbeline, Shakespeare's most complicated romance, there are several types of family structures and parental models depicted, 4 to be exact. And although less complex than Shakespeare's play, Massinger's comedy, A New Way to Pay Old Debts, also illustrates familial bonds and acquisition of parental authority in 4 different ways. The various representations of non-biological parent-child relations, what the critic Elizabeth Gager refers to as fictive ties, suggest that there was no explicit model for what constituted parenthood in the period. Black parents and their black blood, more or less in control on the early modern stage, is the title of my 3rd chapter. In addition to focusing on race, it contains elements of the previous 2 chapters, as it also considers surrogacy and courtship intermediaries. The examination of black parents and their black blood focuses on dramatic parental figures who I define as black in accordance with early modern notions of blackness. What can readers and audiences learn from these fictional portrayals of black parents that were crafted in English minds? I'm interested in how such parents were developed and illustrated as parents by the English imagination, and how early modern audiences may have identified or not with the parental roles they held. Specifically, I focus on Aaron from Titus Andronicus and Barabbas from Marlowe's The Jew of Malta, and their familial relationships. I consider how their blackness has an impact on their parental conduct and authority. It is in this chapter that African American and early modern literature merge, as I weave in allusions to Du Bois, Nella Larson, and Pauline Hopkins. And my final chapter, fittingly labeled Parental Death, The End, is there to think about the ways that parents die, and not just one way, but 2 ways. The most obvious way that one experiences parental death is through the physical passing of a mother or father. Hamlet is one of the best examples of a play that dramatizes the effects of parental death on the child. Shakespeare suggests that even from the depths of the grave, parental authority, dramatized here through a ghostly form, affects the child. In Hamlet, King Hamlet's ghost possesses a significant parental presence. The authority comes from a deceased figure who still manages to command respect and obedience from his son. Thus, parental authority endures, but not always. When a child's passing precedes his or her parents' deaths, as is the case in Thomas Kyd's The Spanish Tragedy, then the terms mother and father consequently lose their active meaning. When this happens and parents are left childless, each parent experiences what I understand as a kind of death of the parental self. For 16th, 17th century women in particular, this was especially difficult because children were essentially status markers that allowed females to make the expected social transitions from daughters and maids to wives, to mothers, and then, in some cases, widows. Now, since I offered you a prologue at the beginning, I'm going to give you an epilogue. So here it is. I regard my dissertation, Placing Parents on the Early Modern Stage, as my scholarly opportunity to amplify the lasting effects of my Trinity education. The impact that various members of the Trinity community had on me then, and even now, compelled me to make my way to the front of the classroom, so to speak, and empowered me to be the hybrid teacher-scholar I am, one who sees himself plainly as an early modern scholar, parentheses added. My interest in English Renaissance literature feeds my constant desire to defy expectations, to go down the road not taken by many. Crossing the color line, my course was for me, for Trinity, and for early modern studies, relatively new terrain that needs further exploration. There is growing anxiety among Renaissance scholars about the future of Shakespeare studies in the liberal arts curriculum. In fact, in St. Louis at the Shakespeare Conference this past weekend, I learned that some liberal arts programs around the country, such as Randolph-Macon College in Virginia, have eliminated Shakespeare courses and consolidated early modern offerings. I find this deeply troubling, especially as I consider whether or not I would be standing here before you today on the path that I am on if Trinity had not given me Shakespeare, Spenser, Milton, and Webster. It seems to me that one solution for dealing with growing anxieties in Shakespeare and early modern studies is Shakespeare and. That is to say, pairing Shakespeare with something else that also works and challenges students, be it a course on Shakespeare and illusions or Shakespeare and African American literature, for example. These kinds of approaches will require early modern scholars to be multidimensional and innovative while recognizing that Shakespeare and his contemporaries can remain present, important, and alive even when they are destabilized. Thank you. Very hot in here.
I'm very sure that David will be glad to answer a few questions or hear a few comments. We have he stayed well within his time, so we have time. So please.
David, can you elaborate a bit on kinds of responses you got from students in this course, which is much unlike any other course they've ever taken?
Responses in terms of whether...
What sort of expectations did they come into the room with, and how did those manifest themselves in your...
That's a good question. I don't really know if at the beginning they had expectations, but some of them are in the room, so maybe they can tell you. But because I just recall, that very opening class. I know one of the things that they were hoping to come away with, and based on the course evaluations, most of them felt they came away with them, was thinking about crossing different types of literature and thinking across periods and sort of expanding their critical thinking abilities in that way. But also expanding their sensitivity, I think, to different cultures, because we talked about a lot of different topics. Of course, we dealt with early modern and African American literature, but within that, we did deal with very sensitive subjects such as homosexuality, and race actually was one of the probably more difficult concepts and subjects that we dealt with as a class. But that really was a through line in the course, so we were constantly talking about race. So that was one of the challenges, but I think in terms of those expectations, it really was about those contrasts and being able to see similarity through difference. I don't know, Victoria, you're shaking your head. Is that?
Yeah, I think I was surprised how many connections ended up coming through and how often we ended up referencing just small details of early modern, and then with the more modern texts. So I think that I came away with finding that there was more connections than I had anticipated under the surface upon looking at it. But again, it was a lot through how they were different. It was what connected them.
And the same was true for me. And I mean, I didn't go into that thinking that I knew everything that we were going to discover as well. But I remember actually a brilliant connection that Candace Baker, who is sitting here, was in my course last semester. And we were talking about Titus Andronicus. And we were also talking about, I think, Harriet Jacobs' incidents in the life of a slave girl. And this really stuck out in my mind because I thought it was a very important connection that Candace made that I wasn't even really, it wasn't on my radar. But basically, in Titus Andronicus, most of you may be familiar with that play, probably not actually, because it's one of Shakespeare's worst, so to speak. But there's a character called Lavinia who gets raped and mutilated. And so her tongue is cut out and her hands are cut off. And so she's not actually able to speak and articulate who her, who has accosted her. And Candace made a point about how Lavinia's ability to read, literacy, was something that saved her in that moment, because she basically goes into a text and shows her father, her uncle, and nephew a similar story about rape, and then she's able to sort of scroll in this sort of phallic way the names of her, the rapists into the sand. And so Candace made a connection there to how literacy was also important for African American slaves to be able to access freedom, because it is through that connection for Lavinia that she's able to tell her family, and they're able to then help her resolve her issues, and she's sort of freed from not having her rapists run free, so to speak. So they are then become imprisoned, basically. So I thought that was a nice connection. Yes, yeah.
I asked you a different sort of question. I'm sorry if I don't remember this, but are you making the argument, or other folks making the argument, that early modern writers such as Shakespeare, Marlowe, whatever, were conscious of notions of either crossing, your notion of crossing, or of identity in that sense? Or is it us trying to make those connections by reading in more kind of modern notions of them? Or let me say, or is there, and I mean, I know you can't channel Shakespeare.
Yes, I can.
I know I can't channel it, so I need you to...
So that's one of the things that I think makes race and Shakespeare and quotes around them, reading them together, one of the sort of heavily debated topics in early modern studies, because race is a modern concept that was developed and, came into fruition after the 16th, 17th century. And so for me personally, I do believe that there is an awareness. That's why I sort of think about the things that are going on in the period that spoke to a lot of the texts that we dealt with, the modern texts, as anticipated by what Shakespeare was doing. There are clearly, racialized characters in Shakespeare's canon, so I think compared to other folks like Marlowe, who didn't write as much as Shakespeare, I don't know if we can really see and say the same thing about Marlowe's work, but within Shakespeare's canon, I do believe that we can talk about race, and so that's why I'm doing it. And the way that I come to it is by thinking about what race meant in the early modern period and what it means in the modern. So race was not defined as somatic ethnic difference in the early modern period. It was actually defined as kinship and surnames, your race. So the Browns are here, they are part of my race. In our modern sense, that maybe not the best example because they're also brown, but you get my point. And in our modern sense, though, we think about race in terms of I can look at my family, my sister, and see that we are connected because of how we look. But the interesting connection for me between race in its early modern definition and its modern difference, or definition rather, is that blood actually is important in both. And so that's why I think there was an awareness of what we think of now as race. Yeah.
So what about identity then?
What, and
That's your other theme, identity.
what do you want to know? What's your question?
Do you you also see that role in conceptualization?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were huge concerns with identity, especially, I mean, one of the things that I'm doing in my project is thinking about women and racial others. And so when I look at particularly the characters in the plays and how their identities were shaped, and also even some of the diary excerpts that I've been able to look at, there's a keen awareness of wanting to have and define that self. And I think that rings true when we get to, you know, the sort of antebellum, postbellum period in our nation's history. African Americans wanting to fight to define their selves and have selves, and reach their freedom in that way. So I do think that identity is there as well, yeah. Yes, Sheila.
One of the things, many things I find compelling about your project is how it could be expanded to develop other kinds of curriculum models based on this notion of crossing lines that have not been crossed before in the curriculum. And I'm just wondering if you thought about this at all. I mean, years ago, an article came out that compared Patient Griselda in Chaucer's Clerk's Tale with the color purple.
Okay.
And it was doing something that, I mean, medievalists love to talk about things like sources and analogs. Right?
Okay.
And it wasn't claiming that there was any source in Chaucer's Clerk's Tale, but it was kind of citing this kind of analog of women's oppression. I don't think that's what you're doing. You're doing something quite different from old-fashioned sources and analog studies, and looking at lines that need to be crossed in order to create connections that haven't been seen before. And I think that's a fascinating way to think about curricular development, especially as you talk about the anxiety of the Shakespeare Association. You know, anxiety that writs, either small or large, this kind of the death of humanities we're going to have all the time. Do you see other kinds of lines we can cross in order to remake curricula in literature, let alone in the rest of humanity?
I do, actually. One thing that I was thinking about, because I deal with, in one of my chapters, early modern city comedy. And so the city comedies are, it's a subset of comedy, basically. And the city comedies focus on the city of London, but they're very concerned with the economy of London. So I thought, how could we get econ majors, you know, maybe into the English department? We could offer, you know, a course where we deal with early modern city comedies, but we think about how economics is operating, how the city is working and functioning. We're getting students exposed to English literature in that regard. But I think that could be done. Things have been done with film as well. You know, Mila and I have talked about that, and I think there are some things that haven't been done with film, though, and that's one thing recently that I was discussing with Mila, is just thinking about you could do an entire course based on Shakespeare and race in terms of film. And so looking at the ways that Shakespeare is represented through different races in film. So there's that 1990s film, Romeo Must Die, where Juliet and Romeo are not white at all. It's an Asian and an African American. So I think there are ways to continue to make those kinds of crosses so that, again, we can expand what's being done. There were some interesting things, since you mentioned the Shakespeare Association conference, there were some interesting things that were raised, and one of the, I guess, most fascinating ones that stuck out to me was Shakespeare and service. So thinking about service, like community service, basically, thinking about how you can take Shakespeare out of the classroom and apply it elsewhere. And I know you kind of do that with the prison work that you do. So not exactly novel, but it's something that could be done with Shakespeare and, you know, the learning corridor or something like that. So yeah, I do believe it is possible to make those kinds of connection crosses. Any students have any questions? Don't be shy.
While you're thinking of your last question, we will allow one more and hope it comes from a student. If not, we'll take one from someone else. There is something about that Black Macbeth that's interesting, and that is in the 19th century. That was one of the roles that African actors, Afro-based actors, Afro-British actors, African-American actors were allowed to play. They could play Othello, They could play Richard III, and they could play Macbeth. The three black villains are one of the black hero of Shakespeare's plays. And so that metaphorical blackness really translated into kind of a theatrical blackness that was really an interesting chapter in the history of performance. Do we have one more question?
Yeah.
Henry. Like I said, I'm interested in the field of early modern studies, and this kind of hybridity that you're working with. Is there any kind of people who are against, who are more traditionalist and would,
Yes.
would be opposed to doing this kind of thing? Or do you have, at least when you were in St. Louis, people who were kind of supporting what you were doing as well? And how are those tensions kind of playing themselves out?
So that's a great question. It's a heavy question. The short answer, I guess I'll give you two answers. So in the space where I was distributing my paper, it was well received. Now, if we take that out and put it in the broader context with those 1,500 members, there's certainly it's going to be contentious. And that kind of goes back to the question that Dina was asking about race and Shakespeare studies. Some scholars really just kind of want Shakespeare to be Shakespeare. They don't want to see Shakespeare and anything else. But I personally think that Shakespeare and is important, particularly for the reason, that basically what my students were able to get out of it last semester. And thinking about crossing those lines was doing more than just, as I said, during the talk, mixing black and white authors, but it was really forcing them to carry the knowledge of two totally different cultures. And when I think about the sort of status of the liberal arts curriculum and the fate of the humanities, so to speak, I came from an English department and I didn't go directly into graduate school. I worked after. So that tells me that there are valuable skills that you can gain from being in any kind of English literature course that you can then take out into the world with you. So the race thing, it's contentious, but and as I said, within that 1,500, there's only about 3%, so 45 people of color. And basically, it is primarily the people of color who are doing that work. So again, trying to sort of change that and educate people and get them to accept new ideas is definitely one of the challenges in early modern studies. Amber, did you have a question?
Yeah, and it's kind of building on what you both have kind of mentioned. So, you mentioned that Professor Thompson states, we need undergraduates and graduates that are interested in this type of work, the Shakespeare and I just wanted to ask you, where do you think that disconnect lies? Because I had my interest in the Shakespeare and kind of was sparked in middle school by one of my middle school teachers, and it was kind of continued throughout high school. But even so, even in college, you'll find that there are a very small number of us that are still interested in Shakespeare and continuing our study of Shakespeare. What would you say lies that disconnect between students and the interest for wanting to continue with the study?
I think it's fear. That would be my short answer to that question, because I know for me, when I left Trinity, I knew I had an interest in Shakespeare, but I never actually ever saw that I would be standing here in this room doing this, to be quite honest. Because I was afraid that, one, if I even tried to do what Mila and David and Sheila and Dina do, that I would fail. And also because I didn't really have, well, at least I thought I didn't have any examples of people who looked like me. But what I realized is that doesn't actually matter. And I think that's why it was so important for me to reflect on having the African American literature professor who was white, because it's sort of the inverse of now what I'm doing, essentially. So I think it really comes to fear, and if that's something that you're interested in doing or pursuing, you have to push yourself towards it, but also make those around you who can support you aware of that interest, so that, like I have my academic godmother standing next to me here, they will help you. They will help you through. So that's what I would say where that disconnect lies.
And on that note, before it gets any more out of hand, shall we just